This is my first time writing a post, so I hope it'll satisfy you. For a little backstory, I'm a scout since I'm 8 years old. And last year, I was the leader of my team, so I had to do all the paperwork and calls to finding places to camp. It was mid-November. I had to find a place to camp, but since I was lazy, I decided to wait a week before the actual weekend. A week before the weekend, I decided to call some owners so I can have a place to sleep. As I call many numbers, all the owners are unavailable or simply not here. But then I see a number which I've never called before. Since it's at the end of the list, I call, and an old lady picks up the phone. I do the basic presentation and all. She agrees to let me and my team stay at hers, and we make agreements. The afternoon, I got to her property to check everything, such as portable water, the place to put the tent, and the campfire. The place is kind of dark, but it's nice. The week passes and Saturday arrives. The Saturday is ending well. We did some great games, we ate a lot. We had a good night's show. As they go to sleep in the tent, I stay awake to finish paperwork for the next day. It is now midnight and I decide to go to sleep because we have to wake up early to go to church. As I switch off the flashlight, one of my newbie, we are all 8 in total, wants to go to the toilets, aka a tree, and asks me to come with her. I can understand because it's better to be accompanied at night, especially in the woods. She does her business and I suddenly hear some noises from far away, but not that far. I tell myself it's nothing. It might be some animals trying to find food. We go back to the tent and that's when I hear footsteps approaching. As I hear those footsteps, I remain calm and tell myself, maybe it's the old lady, checking if we did make fire too close or something. But I still have an odd feeling because it's midnight, and why would she do this at this hour? Then I hear no more footsteps for about 10 minutes. Then I hear more coming to our tents. Thankfully, all the girls are sleeping, because they would have been scared. I was the oldest one. They were about 3 or 4 years younger. As I hear footsteps, which seems to be coming from one person, I hear others coming from the back of the tent. And I was like, okay, this is getting weird. I need to do something. I check the tent by the inside, and thank God, one of my newbies left some embers from the fire, so I could see what was happening between the fire and the zip of my tent. A minute passes by, and a silhouette is there, just between the fire and my tent. I stopped breathing. I literally froze. I started to move towards my phone when I saw the silhouette coming closer to the zip of the tent. I sent a message to one of my bosses, who are always camping in the near areas if something happens, but I knew she would take too long, so I had to think of something, and think fast. That's when I had an idea. I put my alarm on like a big siren, because sometimes we would do like night games and wake up in the middle of the night. So I put my bell on and all the girls woke up. The silhouette had started to unzip. I actually saw fingers from below, but as the silhouette heard my girls waking up, she or he sprinted back to where he came from. That's when I saw 2 other silhouettes sprinting back in the same direction. Everything ended well. 20 minutes later, my boss came and stayed the night. I never had to deal with those silhouettes again, thankfully. When I was a teenager, my older brother moved out and my parents both worked late. So occasionally I would spend evenings by myself after school. We lived in the countryside a few miles outside of town and had a good collection of neighbors. The day went as normally as ever. I went to school, got home, turned on the TV, had a snack, and texted one of my friends, who I had a crush on. It wasn't long after that I noticed a man outside of my house. He walked past a few times. He wasn't an ordinary person walking around the block. He looked scraggly and unkempt. I ducked as far as I could behind the chair, still trying to see him out of the living room windows, hoping he didn't see me. But soon he came to the front door and knocked. I was texting my friend the entire time. increasingly getting freaked out. As he knocked on the door, I stupidly went to answer. I had my phone on me with 911 at the ready. I tried to silently unlock the door to not alert the man. I opened the door a crack. There was a screen door separating myself from the man. I was ready to slam the door and lock it if anything happened. The man looked at me with crazed, paranoid eyes. He had a large, dark beard and looked to be in his late 50s, maybe early 60s. He seemed out of breath and his face was drenched with sweat. He was larger too, more to the reason to keep my guard. I sheepishly said, "Hello?" "Please, call the police, they're after me," he said in an exhausted smoker's voice. He kept looking at the road and tensed whenever a car would occasionally pass by. "Who's after you?" I asked, getting ready to slam the door. "I barely escaped. They were right behind me. Please, can I come inside?" At this point, I knew to call the police. "Just wait here. I'll get someone to help." My heart was in my throat at this time. I don't know if this guy was then going to try to force open the door, so I quickly shut it and locked it. I ran to the back door and locked that as well and called 911. My heart was racing and I could barely tell the operator my information, but they said they would send somebody out. It wasn't long until a patrol car arrived, but it felt like forever. The entire time I kept watching the man, who had then walked into my driveway, pacing nervously. The officer got out and proceeded to talk to the man, and they got in the car and left. I have no idea what happened to him, nor if he was telling the truth. He could have been drunk or crazy, but it was genuine fear in his eyes when I looked at him. Something truly scared him, and it scared me to think that there could be someone out there that wanted people for whatever reason. So, for the crazed, scared man, and whoever he was running from, let's not meet. So, when I was 15, I was completely incorrigible and hung out with some not so great people. My main friend group I hung out with was at this house that we dubbed our house. Our house was technically a foreclosed property that had previously been owned by one of my friend's parents. The parents had moved out and left their 2 adult children, who were the siblings of my friend my age, living at the house. Anyways, every single day after school, my friends and I would meet up with this older sibling at our house and get absolutely hammered. Around 4 p.m., everyone would show up with fifths and drugs, and it was just a constant party every night. Things were pretty out of control there. One night, we were all drunk as fuck, as usual, and I got in a fight with my boyfriend. I decided I wanted to leave, but no one wanted to drive me home, and the buses had stopped running. It was late, probably 12 or 1 a.m. I lived 6 miles away, and this was an urban area that was sketchy to walk at night. But I was pissed and drunk, so I told everyone to go fuck themselves and left. I got 3/4 of the way home without incident. I hadn't seen a single car or person, and drives right next to me. This goes on for maybe 30 seconds when I start to feel genuinely uncomfortable and glance up. The bus stops and the driver opens the door. He's not wearing a uniform. I still remember him pretty clearly. 50-something, salt and pepper hair, medium length for a man. Thick, darker gray beard, copper wire rimmed glasses. He leans against the driver's wheel and looks me up and down. "You look really young," he says. And I, like an idiot, stutter that I'm 15, thinking, like most 15-year-olds, that 15 isn't young. He smiles really slow and said this is a dangerous area to be walking alone, and there's all types of men out there. Why don't I get on the bus? Now, I may have been drunk, I may have been 15, and I may have been deludedly self-confident, but I wasn't that stupid. Something just didn't feel right, you know? I told him no thank you and quickly started walking away. For a while, the bus behind me didn't move, and then I heard its brakes lift and it started creeping up behind me again. By this time, I'm over the bridge and walking down a sidewalk with apartment complexes on either side. The bus pulls up again and opens its doors while following me. The man again tells me it's not safe and asks me to get on the bus. I told him no, I'm really almost home. It's fine. I start walking faster. He closes the door but keeps the bus pace with me, and I'm really starting to worry. Finally, I decide just to run. So I start running, and at first I put some distance between myself and the bus, but he's still behind me. I slow down when I feel far away and catch my breath, but kept walking. Next thing I know, the bus starts gaining on me again and honks its horn. I screamed and fell over, still super drunk and now very scared. I got up and scurried into the neighborhood at my side and hid behind one of the carports. I could still see the road and the bus had stopped. Its doors opened and the man came to the doorway and looked at both directions. He lingered there for a moment, and then I heard him say, "Shit," and he got back to his seat, closed the doors, and drove away. It took me another 30 minutes to get home, even though it was less than a mile at that point, because I took a convoluted way through the bushes, yards, and apartment complexes. Terrified, the bus was still cruising around looking for me. So, to that bus driver all those years ago, let's not meet again. First of all, I'm going to introduce myself a little bit. I'm Mel, 20 years old, not from the US. I want to excuse myself if I have any spelling/redaction mistakes, because English is not my first language. Also, if this post does not belong here, I will delete it. Anyways, this incident occurred 8 years ago, in 2012. I was 12 at the time. For background, my mom bought me a phone to keep communication better. Otherwise, I wanted a mobile so bad. I had to attend school as usual. Class time was since 12 p.m. until around 6 p.m. So I just organized my bag with every notebook I needed for classes. And I had put my brand new phone inside of my pocket. It was 4 p.m. and all of a sudden, another teacher, Sarah, told our class group that the next teacher wasn't at school and that he was sick, so we had no class with him. She asked if we wanted to go home or just play football/basketball until our parents arrived for us. We all agreed on leaving early. I first left school and then called my mom, who was working. I told her we didn't have class, so we could leave early. Something normal. As soon as I was walking the street, I noticed a weird man who was staring at me from a few meters away. It was strange because he had some sort of cutlass or machete. I just ignored him. I didn't think he was going to harass me or something like that. All the while, I was just arriving home. I checked if I had my keys, and I didn't. My house has a grid, and it was kind of difficult to open. I decided to call my mom again because I can't enter. She told me I had to wait until she arrives in 30 to 40 minutes. So I decided to wait in front of my house. A few minutes passed by, and then appears the same man who was staring at me. With that being said, he was following me. I was freaking out and so scared. This man had a machete and a gun. He showed me all of that. I really couldn't speak or move to anywhere. He started yelling at me and shaking me off. I remember he had told me, "Give me your things or your life. I'm gonna kill you." I obviously gave him my phone, my notebooks, and my bag. I prefer to lose material things in my own life. The man left, and it was a completely shocking moment. I didn't know what to do. I just stood completely shook. I started to cry, and then a neighbor noticed me, and Patricia asked me what had happened. She took me to her house until my mom arrived. I told my neighbor everything, so she called the police. My mom finally arrived. My neighbor had a conversation with her. The police arrived too. They asked me a lot of things I found confusing. After that, they went with my mom. I don't know what happened next. Now I live in a constant paranoia when it comes to being in the streets. So, man who robbed, scared, and harassed me. Let's not meet again. please, don't judge some of my incredibly stupid decisions on my creepy encounter. I was young. So when I was 15, my sister and I ran away from home. Dumb decision number one. I was gone for a total of about 6 months. At some point, for about 2 weeks, we were living in a rundown motel. One night while I was by myself, I was sitting on the stairs of the motel, flipping through some magazine. Stupid decision number two. A grown man walks to me and starts to talk to me. He asks my name and why I'm sitting outside. I asked him if he was a cop. Extremely stupid decision number three, since this shows him I do not want cops involved, as I was a runaway. He asked, "Do I look like a cop?" He didn't. He said that he had some alcohol in his room. He was willing to share if I'd like to come up and drink with him. At 15, to me, free alcohol sounded great. I said okay and went with him to his room. That's stupid decision number four. We got to his room and began drinking and talking a bit. I forget what I asked him, but at some point I asked him something that made him get out his ID and show it to me. Under his name, I noticed it had offender under his name in red. Warning bells went off, and I asked what that meant. He replied, "What do you think it means?" At that point, I just wanted to get the hell out of there. As I'm thinking that, an additional grown man walks into the room. He sees me, smiles, and they both nod at each other. I'm now in a locked motel room with two grown men. I turn to the first guy and tell him something, like I have to get something out of the room real quick, and I'll be right back up. I must have sounded believable, because he said, "You'll come right back." I said, "Of course. I want to keep drinking." He then asked what room number I was in. I lied and made up one, of course. By the grace of God, he let me out of that room. I briskly walk back to my room. Not even a minute later, the phone rings and I pick it up. "Why did you lie to me?" I said, "What do you mean?" "You lied about your room number. I watched you go into your room." I told him it must have slipped my mind, as I was talking to him earlier. He then told me to come back upstairs to his room so we can keep hanging out. I told him I'd be right up. I then proceeded to unplug the phone from the wall and curl up in a ball, since I was so afraid he would try to come find me. I still to this day do not know why he let me leave. He didn't have to. Lord knows what would have happened to me that night. Scary to think, since I was a runaway, no one would have known anything. I had no ID and was going by a different name. I looked up what offender means. Most websites say that it means a person is a sex offender or out of parole. I was so lucky that night. Surprisingly though, it took me becoming an adult to realize the danger I was in that night. To me at 15, he was a creepy guy, and instinctively knew I had to get out of there. But it wasn't until years later that I really understood how bad the situation could have been. Okay, so I will try to sum this up as best as possible. When I, 30 and female, was about 13, I was out riding my bike with my best friend, a neighbor, around our neighborhood. We did this every day, and this occurred on a weekend in the afternoon. As we're riding around, there was a girl, maybe 15, driving a golf cart down the street. This was abnormal, and I had never seen her before. She stopped, and we were excited about the golf cart, so she offered us a ride. We were taken to a house we had seen a million times before, as it was down our block. I personally had never seen anyone outside the house, and it was heavily gated. As we went in, I got the worst feeling. The house had no furniture, black tarps, garbage bags covering the walls, strange men everywhere, but no one seemed to interact with each other. We were led outside and some guy started talking to us. Randomly, there was a girl who crawled out of a hole in the ground that had a heavy metal top, a bomb shelter of some kind, circular and old. When I asked the guy about it, he laughed and said that it was an old underground room, and if we went down there, that we would never come out. I felt the intense need to leave, but my friend wanted to stay. Yes, I know. We went upstairs to a large bedroom with a visibly dirty old mattress on the floor, a desk, and a computer. There was a younger girl, around 8 or 9, and she seemed very scared and off. The girl who brought us there claimed they were sisters. I got the impression that the younger girl was not allowed to leave the room. The older girl left the room, I don't remember why, and my friend and I started to ask the younger girl if she was okay. She told us that they moved a lot, had to sleep on dirty mattresses, and were barely given food. Once the older girl came in, the younger girl went silent, and my friend and I were freaked the hell out. We walked out and went back down the stairs. I saw that no one was looking/backs were turned, and I made a dash to the front door, where my GF behind me, and I went home and told my parents, but they tried to assure me that it was nothing. I lied about everything except meeting the girl, because I was afraid I would get in trouble. 3 days later, we drove by in my parents' car, and the house was empty and listed for sale. This was in Northridge, California. I moved out of state a long time ago, but I'm still super curious as to what I encountered more specifically. Obviously, it was a trafficking ring. There had been other crazy things that are in the same vein in my life, but I will save those for another post.
This happened when I was much younger. I want to say a freshman in high school, probably like 2008. There used to be this road near where I lived in California called Croak Road. It was barely a road, no one traveled on it, and it was surrounded by small patches of forest and some abandoned barns and houses. I would typically go there with friends to skateboard and hang out. This one night I was hanging out with 2 of my friends, Lucas and Dorian, and someone wanted to go to Croak Road to hang out since it was creepy at night. It might sound lame, but we loved exploring like a bunch of 5th graders and weren't really into smoking or anything, so what else was there to do? I asked my 20-year-old brother James if he could drive us down into one of the nature reserves by the road. This specific reserve was larger than the others and had a network of gravel paths leading through it. Basically, we were looking for unexplored territory to hike in. Soon one particular path we were traveling down had become so narrow, James's Ford Explorer couldn't pass through it, so we got out and walked for a while, chatting and just having fun. We walked through the woods for about half an hour until it had gotten relatively dark out and the sun was gone, at which point we turned around to head back to the car. So now I should mention that despite being near a lot of subdevelopments, this patch of forest was huge, I'd say about 1,000 acres, and rarely visited since it was easy to get lost in, especially at night. It was a challenge getting the car turned around, but James managed it and we were off down the road. Dorian proposed we turn down a different path we had passed by earlier since we had about another 40 minutes until our parents wanted us back, and we agreed. Down this path was a tiny pond Dorian wanted to check out to take pictures of since he hadn't gotten the opportunity to visit it at night. It was slow going since this road was even crappier than the main one we were traveling on that turned off of Croak Road. Minutes later we got into a slight argument. Dorian was convinced James had taken a wrong turn since we should have arrived at the pond by now, while James claimed that he had been driving straight the whole time. It was dark after all. Eventually we came to a fork in the road that none of us were familiar with. None of us knew which way to go, so we ended up guessing and going left, hoping that both directions would ultimately lead back to the main path. None of us were scared or anything. In fact, we were actually excited and intrigued, driving through seemingly the middle of nowhere at night. It was at this point we rounded a small bend in the road and the headlights fell upon a surreal sight. There was 4 figures emerging from the forest and crossing the road, wearing what looked to be long cloaks with the hoods up and holding flashlights. One guy at the back of the group was dragging a large duffel bag, a human-sized duffel bag. We all froze and stopped mid-conversation, and as soon as our high beams landed on the 4 figures, they froze as well. James pulled to the left and went around them. Driving past them felt like an eternity because we couldn't have been going over 5 miles an hour due to the shitty condition of the road. Sitting in the passenger seat, I could see them inches beyond my window, and they were indeed wearing black robes and holding flashlights. I didn't get a good look at the bag, but judging by the way the guy was holding it, something heavy was inside. None of us said a word until the road straightened out and we were far past these guys, at which point James just muttered, "What the hell was that?" We continued down the road in silence until I heard Lucas say, "Holy shit," and repeat himself in a louder, panicked voice. He said, "They're fucking coming back." I twisted around in my chair to see Lucas pointing out the back window. I could barely see anything, but about 100 yards away, we saw the beams of 4 flashlights shaking erratically. These guys were without a doubt running after us. All of us screamed at James to floor it, and he sped down the road. The car was bouncing and shaking uncontrollably as we flew over berms and potholes. I kept my eyes on the flashlight beams until we rounded another bend in the road and they were out of sight. Thankfully, the path did manage to take us back to the main path. James gunned it down the path until we popped off by Croak Road and got the hell out of there. The weirdest thing about it was there couldn't have been a vehicle anywhere near those guys for 50 miles in either direction. We would have seen one if there had been. We'd explored most of the area before, and there wasn't anywhere to pull off the road and park. We didn't say anything more until we were back at my place. We talked about it for a bit, and then my friends went home and James and I went to bed. I didn't know if I should call the cops or not, but James, who I'd guess would be the adult in the situation, seemed reluctant, so I dropped it. I never told my parents until just before writing this, and they kind of scolded me for not telling them, and that we should have contacted the authorities just to report suspicious people in the reserve. I still wish to know how the hell they got there, where they were going, and what was in the bag. A few years ago, I went camping for the first time in my life. I was around 11 or 12 when we headed out to a forest nearby our house. We were in Poland for the holidays, as every year, and right next to our house was a huge forest. So one day we decided to take out my mom's old tent that she still had from like the 90s and just stay the night or two. So one day we decided to take out my mom's old tent she still had from like the 90s and just stay for the night or two. So one day we decided to take out my mom's old tent that she still had from like the 90s and just stay a night or two in between some wildlife. A good thing was the place we chose to sleep at was only about 20 or maybe 30 minutes away from the house. The bad thing was there are a lot, and I mean a lot, of wolves, foxes, and boars out in that forest, and honestly I kind of regretted going there in the first place. We set everything up at around 6 p.m. and my sister and I set up the campfire. My dad chopped down a smaller tree earlier with his oak axe, and by now it had dried enough to catch fire. We sat around it for quite some time, probably around 4 hours, until it was dark, so we decided to just head to sleep then. My 2 sisters and I are on one end of the tent and my parents on the other. It was probably just the fear of getting eaten alive by some wolves or homesickness, but I couldn't sleep at all. I heard my dad tell my mom he was going out into the forest for some wood for the morning while it was still fairly dry, or it would have all soaked up the dew by then. The thought of not having my dad around made it even worse for me to even close my eyes for a second. I'm not too good at telling what time it is just by staring at the sky, or trying to figure out how long it had been, so I'll say it was around 12 or 1 in the morning. I was actually beginning to fall asleep when I heard some rattling outside the tent. My first thought, wolf. I was petrified and so just... I was terrified, and so I popped my head out through the little curtain that separated the 2 halves of the tent, and to see if my dad was back. He was still gone, and it has been about an hour since he went. I lay back down and just tried to fall asleep, but when I turned myself on my side, I saw this faint human shadow outside the tent. I froze and let out a teeny squeak. This person seemed to be holding some sort of axe, shovel type thing in its hand, and so I thought it may have just been my dad back. The shadow walked towards the entrance of the tent and just stood there at the zipped up door for maybe 30 seconds. I began to wonder why he wasn't just coming inside. The person finally ran off into the forest, but it dropped the axe. You could hear the footsteps fade in the distance and a thump just appear along the way. Maybe a minute or so later, I hear my dad walking back from the opposite side of the forest and enter the tent all tired and just fell asleep. Seemed kind of sketchy and fishy and scary to me, but it was so late I couldn't even think anymore and somehow I fell asleep. The next morning I woke up The next morning, I woke up after my dad dropped his phone on his face, letting out an ouch. I peeped through the curtain at him, and he just smiled back while rubbing his nose. I needed some fresh air because I was feeling a bit sick, maybe from the nerves in the morning or homesickness. I couldn't really tell. Both of us got out of the tent and walked around for a while. We circled around the campsite for around 10 minutes until we came back to our tent. That's when I noticed something that ran chills down my back. A few meters from the tent, in the corner of my eye, I managed to catch a glimpse of something red. It took me a hot second to realize I actually saw something, and when I turned my head to see what it was a red and black rubber axe. It was not there before. I knew it wasn't my dad's because his was by the pile of wood he collected at night. From my dad's reaction, I probably turned pale because he started to freak out a little, like I was about to pass out or something. He turned his gaze to where I was looking, and we both just stared a few seconds before he called out for the rest of the family to wake up and get moving. We were all packed up within an hour, and we rushed back home. I later told my dad what I saw that night, and he wouldn't believe me at first. I carried on with the story, and he finally realized I was telling the truth. To this day, I still have no clue who the duck that was. To this day, I still have no clue who that was, but I'm just happy he didn't investigate our tent any further or any animal out in the forest. To this day, I still have no clue who he was, but I'm just happy he didn't investigate our tent any further. I was camping in the middle of nowhere in Washington near Mount Rainier, like an unofficial campground just way out in the forest where I wouldn't have expected another human for miles. One night I wake up and I hear something, open my tent, and there's a guy sitting by where my fire had been right outside my tent. Nothing particularly noteworthy about the guy, just a fairly regular looking dude just sitting there a couple feet away from my tent. No bag or pack or anything with him, just a guy. He saw me open the tent, his eyes got huge like he had just seen a ghost, and he took off. It shook me up pretty badly, but over the next day I managed to put it out of my mind fairly well after writing it off as just some odd occurrence, and a guy that was probably high or something and had somehow managed to set up camp coincidentally not far from mine. Then two days after that, and 10 to 15 miles away in totally random directions that nobody could take the same path as on accident, I was sitting by the fire that night and started hearing noises that I got more and more convinced were a person. I called out to them, and out of the darkness someone was like, "Do you know how to get to Bell's Canyon?" I said no, I don't even think that's a real place here. They kept talking from just out of my line of vision. I tried to see them with my flashlight, but they yelled, "Aim that away," and kind of spooked and not wanting to piss off a potentially crazy person, I did. After like 15 minutes of me being very freaked out and them talking and asking completely random questions from the darkness, it sounded like the voice had gotten closer, so I shined my light that way again, and it was the same dude who had been outside my tent 2 nights before. He had to have followed me almost 15 miles over 2 days because there's no way he could have just accidentally wound up in the same spot, as vast as that wilderness is. No possible way. As soon as my light hit him, he took off again. I started to chase him, but didn't want to get lost in the wilderness. In the dark, so stopped quickly after probably only about 120 feet. This one couldn't be written off, because the only way he could have been in both places specifically if he was following me. I decided the trip was very over the first thing in the morning and hiked back out over 3 days, constantly doubling back, trying to throw anyone following off my trail, and occasionally hiding and waiting to see if he would come by following me. I really can't describe how terrifying it was to feel like I was being hunted through the woods, and to actually have to brainstorm on things I could do to best avoid potentially getting murdered. On the first night of hiking out, twice I heard what sounded like a person walking circles outside my tent, but by the time I mustered the courage to look, nobody was there. On the second night I heard what I thought was an animal making noises at first in the distance, but slowly decided it sounded more like a human making animal calls, but could have actually been an animal, so I didn't actually see the guy again. On the second night I heard what I thought was an animal making noises at first in the distance, but I slowly decided it sounded more like a human making animal calls. I didn't actually see the guy again, but it really sounded like a person making howling noises. I literally almost cried when I finally got back to my car. The relief was so strong. To this day, probably the most terrifying experience I've ever had. I have no idea who the guy was or what his intentions were, and no way of getting an explanation, but I really can't articulate just what a terrifying few days it was.
Hey friends, I really hope you enjoyed the video, and if you enjoyed today's guest narrator, Dr. Gangster's horror stories, please consider subscribing to them. I'll put a link to their channel in the description field down below. And I hope everyone has a good rest of their evening, their night, whatever you're doing. And if you are going out, make sure you're wearing your face mask. I'm so tired of the gyms being closed.